You know, they say silence is the sound of everything being exactly where it's supposed to be. And for 15 years on this patch of dirt I call home, that silence was my sanctuary. But I learned the hard way that when people with too much time and an addiction to petty power start looking at your fence line, that silence is just the fuse burning down on a bomb you didn't in Oppos to even know was planted under your porch. I walked out of my house at 5 a.m. on a Tuesday, the air smelling like damp pine and wood smoke, thinking I was just heading into the city for a 10-hour run to pick up parts for my tractor and maybe a decent steak for dinner. But 10 hours later, I was staring down the barrels of 3 black SUVs blocking my own driveway like I was some kind of international fugitive. And that was just the opening act of circus that was supposed to end with me in handcuffs and my land stripped away by a group of suburbanites in iron polo shirts. See, I don't live in the, Highlands Ridge, subdivision. I just happen to own the 6 acres of prime shoreline that sits right at the mouth of their gated community, a piece of land my grandfather bought back when this whole county was nothing but cattle and scrub brush. And for years, the Highlands HOA, led by a woman named Beatrice Vance who treats a neighborhood newsletter like it's the Geneva Convention, has been trying to, annex, my waterfront to build a private pier for her members. I've said no 100 times, and I've said it in 100 different ways, ranging from, no thank you, to, get off my grass, but I guess Beatrice decided that if she couldn't in Oppos, buy me out or vote me out, she'd just stage a coup while I was out buying hydraulic fluid. But Beatrice made one fatal mistake in her little military-style operation, and his name is Elias, a guy I've known since we were both 18-year-old kids getting screamed at by drill instructors at Paris Island, a man who survived 3 tours in places the maps dawn in Oppos. Even name, and who doesn't in Oppos. Believe in coincidences or uninvited guests. Elias was supposed to drop off a welding rig at my place that afternoon, and when he rolled up to find the, Highlands Safety Task Force, tramping through my woods like they were searching for a lost hiker, he didn't in Oppos. Call the cops, and he didn't in Oppos. Start a fight. He did exactly what he was trained to do. He became a ghost. He melted into the tree line. He pulled out his phone, and he started recording the kind of stupidity that only happens when people think nobody is watching. While I was stuck in city traffic, listening to a podcast and thinking about nothing more complicated than the price of lumber, Elias was watching Beatrice's husband, a man named Gerald who wears a neon vest like he's a 4-star general, supervising a crew of HOA, volunteers, as they committed enough felonies to fill a textbook. He watched them bolt a fake, rusted electrical junction box to my main power pole. He watched them hammer fake, environmentally hazardous, stakes into my garden beds. And most incredibly, he watched them coach a 19-year-old kid named Cody on how to, collapse with grace, if I so much as brushed past him, telling him to make sure he clutched his neck and looked, traumatized, for the cameras they had stationed at every angle. By the time I turned off the main highway and hit the gravel road leading to my gate, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in these bruised shades of purple and orange, and the moment I saw those 3 SUVs parked sideways across my drive, my stomach just did a slow, heavy roll because I knew this wasn't Oppos, a neighborly chat. I rolled my window down, the dust from their tires still hanging in the air, and before I could even get a word out, Gerald was at my door, tapping a clipboard against my side mirror with this smug, self-righteous grin that made my blood pressure spike into the red zone. He told me the, District Safety Commission, a title he'd clearly made up about 20 minutes prior, had declared my property a biohazard zone due to a, leaking transformer, and that I was, legally prohibited, from entering until the Highlands Board had conducted a full forensic audit, all while 3 other guys stood there with their iPhones up, just waiting for me to lose my cool so they could viral video me into a prison cell. I just sat there for a second, my hands gripped so tight on the steering wheel my knuckles were white, looking at Cody sitting on a cooler with a foam neck brace on, looking for all the world like he'd just survived a plane crash. And I realized this wasn't Oppos. A misunderstanding. It was an assassination attempt on my reputation and my rights. I started to open my mouth to tell Gerald exactly where he could shove his clipboard, but then I saw a movement in the shadows of the big oak tree behind them. A slow, deliberate step that didn't end oppose. T make a sound on the gravel. And suddenly Elias was standing there, looking like he'd just stepped out of a fog bank, his arms folded and his face as unreadable as a stone wall. Gerald turned around, his bravado flickering for just a second when he saw the size of Elias and the look in his eyes, but he tried to double down, barking at Elias to, in quote, clear the area, in quote, because this was an, in quote, active enforcement zone, in quote. But Elias didn't in oppose. To even blink, he just looked at me and said, in quote, you're late, in quote. And then he looked back at the HOA crew and told them they had exactly 60 seconds to move their vehicles or things were going to get, in quote, tectonic, in quote. Gerald laughed, this high, nervous sound, and told Cody to, in quote, get ready, in quote. And that's when Gerald made the mistake of trying to push Elias out of the way, a move that lasted about half a heartbeat before Gerald was staring at the sky from the flat of his back. The wind knocked out of him, and his clipboard shattered on the ground. That was the signal for the chaos to start, with Beatrice screaming from the back of an SUV about, in quote, assault, in quote, and, in quote, police intervention, in quote. But what she didn't in oppose, Tino, was that the local sheriff, a man named Miller who had been my high school quarterback and who had a very low tolerance for Beatrice's brand of nonsense, had been on the other end of Elias's live stream for the last hour. When the cruisers pulled up, sirens off, but lights cutting through the dusk like blue lightning, Beatrice ran to Miller like he was her personal bodyguard, pointing at me and Elias and screaming about violence and illegal hazardous waste. But Miller didn't in oppose. To even look at us, he just held up his own phone, which was playing the video of Gerald bolting that fake box to my pole and Cody practicing his, in quote, injury, in quote, while eating a bag of Cheetos. The silence that fell over that driveway was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, as the HOA board members realized that their, in quote, mission, in quote, had an oppose. T just failed. It had been documented in high definition by a man who knew exactly how to capture a crime in progress. Miller spent the next hour handing out handcuffs like they were party favors, charging Gerald with impersonating an official and battery, charging Beatrice with conspiracy and filing a false report, and even giving young Cody a stern lecture on the legal definition of fraud that I suspect he won in oppose. T forget any time soon. As they were being loaded into the back of the cruisers, Beatrice was still trying to argue that, in quote, the community interest, in quote, trumped private property rights, her voice fading into the distance as they drove away, leaving my driveway empty for the first time in 10 hours. Elias and I sat on my tailgate after they left, the lake water lapping against the shore and the crickets finally starting their night song. And I looked at the fake stakes and the shattered clipboard and realized that for some people, the idea of, in quote, community, in quote, is just a weapon they use to hide their own greed and insecurity. My land is still mine. The silence has returned, and the Highlands HOA is currently being dissolved by a state-appointed receiver after Miller's investigation found they'd been embezzling dues to pay for Beatrice's legal fees. But it makes you wonder how many other people are sitting in their homes right now, thinking they're safe, while their neighbors are in a garage somewhere planning their next, in quote, safety inspection, end quote. I've always been a live and let live kind of guy, but after seeing the lengths these people went to just to get a better view of the sunset, I'm starting to think that fences aren't in oppose. T enough. You need witnesses, you need evidence, and it doesn't in oppose. T hurt to have a friend who knows how to hide in the trees. So I'm curious, have any of you ever dealt with a neighbor or an organization that felt they had more right to your life than you did? Or am I just the lucky one who got to see the HOA dragon get its wings clipped in my own front yard? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think I should have been more, in quote, neighborly, in quote, or if Gerald got exactly what was coming to him when he hit the gravel. And hey, if you want to hear more stories about holding the line against the people who think they own the world, hit that subscribe button because out here in the woods, we've got plenty more to tell.